it sort of unfortunately makes all of the liberal hand-wringing about video games being used to train people to be killers. It means that they were right, and that is unfortunate. I always, whenever liberals were like, "Oh, violence in video games," are conservatives too. Conservatives joined in on the violence in video games thing whenever they needed an excuse for why people were doing mass shootings. They joined in with like Tipper Gore and all of the liberals who were concerned about violence in video games and music and stuff like that.
Because people were playing Time Crisis, and so they were really good at ducking and shooting.
Yeah, they were really good at using time travel to go back in time. Wait, that's Time Cop. I don't remember what Time Crisis is. Time Cop is like the guy goes back in time or goes into the future to stop crimes.
Either way. And you probably didn't hear about it because they went back in time and erased it.
Oh, shit. Yeah. Anyway, so as I mentioned, the war in Ukraine triggered rapid drone innovation, which has left the United States behind. Ukraine, this article says, has become the global leader in combat drone use. But if you talk to the Ukrainians, the Russians are the leader in combat drone use. 80% of Ukraine's successful strikes come from drones, which that sounds like, oh, wow, they're really utilizing this technology properly. But that also means that they don't have the capacity to do other kinds of strikes.
Yeah, I was going to say that's not a good thing.
Ukraine has proposed a $50 billion co-production deal with the U.S. to supply 10 million drones annually over 5 years, which is funny because Ukraine currently does not have the capacity to produce enough drones for themselves, which is why they're being so they're being swamped by Russian drones. Russians are really good at hunting down Ukrainian drone operators and killing them with Russian drones. And the Ukrainians rely so heavily on drones because they have so few soldiers on the field. And their over-reliance on these drones has actually become a problem because now that they are completely over-reliant on them and Russia has gotten better at striking the production facilities and drone operators, they're actually having a crisis that is related to their over-reliance on drones. But the article doesn't mention that. Anyway, so Ukraine wants to leverage its, quote, innovation and combat experience to get more U.S. support. In fact, it's done the same with Poland. It's offered to train Polish troops on how to use drones. And I mean, the Ukrainians definitely do have a lot of experience with drones. What they don't have is productive capacity. We've talked at length on this podcast about how they're sort of neoliberalized, decentralized kind of economy there, and their neoliberalized, decentralized, and deindustrialized economy has made drone production arms production very difficult, on top of the fact that Russian drone and missile strikes have been just obliterating anything that the Ukrainians try to build in order to upscale their military production. Yeah, anyway, so Fort Bliss now has an FPV gym. Fort Benning, Georgia is now integrating drones into basic training. And in Fort Bragg, they're training American troops on drones for reconnaissance. And, you know, the thing is that the U.S., just like every other arms production ailment that plagues the U.S., drones are a problem for the United States because the United States used to use Chinese parts in order to produce their drones. That's a problem now. Can we rely on the Chinese in order to produce our arms?
Probably not.
Domestic alternatives are literally 100 times more expensive. That's in quotes. Literally 100 times more expensive. American startups are trying to catch up. There's this company called Neros, which is contracted to supply 6,000 FPV drones for Ukraine. And Anduril, who we talked about previously, supplying drones to Taiwan, then the Russians making fun of Anduril for, supplying something like 30 drones to Taiwan and charging them, $20,000 each per drone, while the Russians are cranking out FPV drones that cost $600 to produce, and they're projected to have created millions of them this year.
That's because the Russians are against innovation.
Oh yeah, they're bad at innovation. So Ukraine pioneered cheap FPV drones with explosives, naval drones, and long-range strike drones, like up to 1,000 plus miles. And this article doesn't say it, but I will say it because we've read a lot about this on the Events in Ukraine page. He did a deep dive into drone combat last month, and we talked about both of the articles from that. And the Russians were able to adopt the Ukrainian innovations and then scale them outwards by orders of magnitude. And they've also created their own drone integrated public-private partnership drone production, innovation, and combat group called Rubicon, which we also read an article maybe last week or the week before that talks about how that is the method that the United States needs to use going forward if we want to be able to keep up with Russia. Not the Ukrainian method.
That even just seems like that would be a no-brainer because it's not like a challenge to private property even.
Yeah.
It's just not exclusively private property.
So this article also talks about like the strategic consequences of drone warfare, how drones are reshaping tactics. There's a 15-mile no-go zone, which is or what they call kill zone, near the front lines in Ukraine. What's funny is the Ukrainians talk about their 15-mile kill zone, and they talk about the Russians' 30-mile kill zone. So it's actually much more in the favor of the Russians than it is the Ukrainians now, because the Russians actually, 30-kilometer kill zone. That the Russians actually have figured out they're ahead of the Ukrainians in distance for their FPV drones, and also in electronic warfare, which this article doesn't mention. Anyway, so basically the takeaways from this article are that drones aren't future tech anymore. They're just the frontline reality. Ukraine, it calls Ukraine the global laboratory for drone warfare. I would say the war in Ukraine is the global laboratory for drone warfare. It's not necessarily the armed forces of Ukraine. And the U.S. military is urgently restructuring in order to try to catch up because it's woefully behind as it stands right now. But there are major problems with industrial bottlenecks, supply chain restrictions, and production capacity in general, and cost. Because everything in the United States, especially when it comes to arms, is way more expensive than it needs to be.
Seems like that could be, we can just get around that pretty easily by just, you could use the War Powers Act to you
want Donald Trump to do that? Use the War Powers Act to make drones?
No. I was going to say, well, we've done that before, like with the COVID vaccine, but no, that was Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
We didn't actually do that.
Okay, so next, we got some spicy content here, and that is the latest post from Events in Ukraine, which is about the United States, actually. And it's called The Order of the Nine Angles in the USA. And it talks about mass shootings in the United States and nihilist accelerationist terror actions. And this is something that we've actually been talking about a lot. I wish I would have read this article before we had our discussion of it, because it would have just been more fodder for the discussion, which I wanted to include it in here, even though this isn't necessarily. It is geopolitically related because we'll get into it, but this it almost seems like more domestic than geopolitical. But I think it has what things that are domestically important here have geopolitical reverberations, and there is sort of a external feed going on when it comes to these nihilist accelerationist terror actions. So essentially, like this article is all about how the Order of the Nine Angles and its offshoots have a disproportionate role in this sort of narrative of crisis, or this kind of the years of lead, the new second dumber years of lead in the United States, which is influencing school shooters and extremist subcultures globally. So the Order of the Nine Angles is a neo-Nazi Satanist accelerationist network that encourages human sacrifice, terror, child abuse of all types, and essentially encouraging depravity and slaughter for the sake of collapsing society into a race war.
Isn't that I feel like the Order of the Nine Angles, isn't that like related in some way to the Minneapolis
We'll get
Catholic
to that.
Church shooting? Oh, okay.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah. So this is basically, we have found that in the United States, in 2021, there was a court case where some service member in the United States military tried to blow up some base in the Middle East in order to start a war with Iran, I think it was, in order to accelerate global conflagration that would result in the collapse of society. And this court case revealed that the most extremist and influential Order of the Nine Angles publisher, Martinet Press, had been headed by an FBI informant for 20 years. The informant, Joshua Sutter, had received over $140,000 from the FBI to propagandize mass murder and child abuse in the United States. And that's something that a United States court found. And there is a Russian connection, too. Martinet Press published The Kiss of Morena, Temple of the Black Sun, an Order of the Nine Angles linked Russian novel about mystical Nazi murder cults. It's written by this guy named Kirill Kanakin, I don't know how to say it, who is a failed actor, who is a member of the Russian Order of the Nine Angles cell, who left Russia to join Ukraine's Azov battalion and eventually became the head of the Russian Volunteer Corps, RDK. And he called for children to rise up against the adults by committing violence like school shootings, killing their parents, and stuff like that.
So it's just like fully regular stuff, just fully normal, regular stuff, you know.
And there are two articles about this on events in Ukraine that are worth checking out. He says that since 2021, there's been a rise in nihilistic neo-Nazi shootings in Russia, many linked to online radicalization and Order of Nine Angles inspired ideology. And he also talks in those articles about how the Ukrainian Secret Services works with the Order of the Nine Angles in Russia to convince children to carry out these acts of violence and stuff like that. And we know for a fact that the leader of the Russian Volunteer Corps and lots of his followers, because he has a band, a satanic black metal band called Hitler's Hammer, which is, you know, they play shows that are put on by the Azov movement. The next section in the article talks about child exploitation and warfare extremism. Like I mentioned, both State Intelligence Agency and the Order of the Nine Angles subcultures have used children through manipulation or blackmail. So he says spooks, this is a quote, meaning, spies.
Like, yeah.
Use sexual blackmail, nude photos, and the like to force children into attacks, strikingly similar to what the Order of the Nine Angles does in order to manipulate children into committing terrorist acts. So he uses a couple of case studies of violence in the United States. The Minneapolis church shooting by Robin Westman. Westman opened fire on the Minneapolis church, killing multiple people. And the essay highlights how these actions were not random, but shaped by an emergence in extremist culture and what he calls terrorgram, which is it's a sort of a nickname for accelerationist neo-Nazi Telegram channels. There's there's the Order of the Nine Angles, and there's an offshoot of the Order of the Nine Angles called Murder Cult, or MKU. And the manifesto of Robin Westman included weapons inscriptions that drew directly from like neo-Nazi Russian accelerationist subcultures. Like he wrote hatred in Russian on his or her. I don't actually, I'm unclear as to whether or not to refer to them as what their preferred pronouns are. Like, I don't know, it seems kind of silly to really worry about what this person who shot up a bunch of children. But anyway, just for the sake of,
Well, it's also just unclear because
right, because
it's not even unclear what they prefer.
Right, they were trans but detransitioning.
Yeah,
and
I think the shooter even said, "I'm tired of being trans."
mm-hmm.
That's a quote.
I said his because that's what the article says, and he mentions that they say they use male pronouns for the shooter because the shooter has claimed to have detransition from being a woman or whatever. Anyway, Westman left behind writings in English that had been transcribed in Cyrillic, which I don't know. That's one of my least favorite things that people do. You can actually I can read the manifesto. Like, I looked at it today and I was like, okay, I know what this says because I read Cyrillic, like, no problem. I have a real hard time with actually reading Russian, but I can read Cyrillic characters. So if you can read Cyrillic characters, you can go and read the manifesto. It's really goofy. But as I mentioned, on the gun, they scrawled the Russian word, or anyway, hatred in Russian. And that is actually something that the head of the Russian Volunteer Corps, he wears a patch with that on his jacket.
Probably unrelated,
And the Columbine shooters wrote hatred on their guns, and the Russian neo-Nazi shooters that are connected to the Order of the Nine Angles have also written hatred obviously in Cyrillic on their guns. So the language and aesthetics of the shooter, of Robin Westman, suggests that they were steeped in the same meme culture that has fueled the attacks in Russia, Ukraine, and the U.S. Even if there wasn't a direct connection to the Order of Nine Angles, it's these sort of terrorgram communities that they were involved in are heavily informed by that culture. And of course, the whole point, one of the points of this article is that the Order of the Nine Angles, it tries to influence people to commit acts of terror, even if they're not directly a part of the Order of the Nine Angles.
Well, obviously, the thing to do is to crack down on, left groups and trans activists. Yeah.
Cult of Murder and Order of the Nine Angles and the U.S. offshoot Temple of Blood, and Agony Point Press. That's what it is. Those are all Order of the Nine Angles related groups in the United States. So, as with the Nashville shooter, the U.S. media focused on identity rather than ideology. So, in the Nashville shooter was a black kid, and he's the one that, I don't know if you read his manifesto, it was all Hitlerian and satanic nonsense, very clearly Order of the Nine Angles, MKU related type of stuff. But they just focused on the fact that he was a black kid. Similarly with Westman's identity being focused on as a trans person, clearly that means that they were a leftist. And, I even sort of fell prey to this whenever I saw an article that was posted that singled out a bunch of sort of left-wing stuff that was written in their manifesto. And I guess it was a New York Post article or something that showed all of that. And I was like, oh, great. That was before the rest of the manifesto was leaked. The New York Post just kind of cherry picked it to make it look leftist, which, fair play. That's what I should have expected from the New York Post. But,
I mean, that's the way it's going to be treated anyways. Like whether or not it's literally true is actually incidental to the way it will be taken as true.